ICs. And what we're going to do here in this demo is kind of walk you through how this game works. It's not going to be an exhaustive study of strategy. Uh, we might cover some optimal strategies in here, but a lot of this is just to show the mechanics of the game, how they work, that sort of thing. If you're watching this by video, I do apologize for the low rumble in the background. I happen to be in the room where the cooler is in the house, so it's a little noisy in the background. Okay, what I've done here, just to kind of set the table, I'll walk you through the Vassal module, which is still a work in progress. I discovered a few more little bugs right before I fired up the module for the demo tonight. So 1.31 is very temporary. There's several things I've wanted to do, just haven't found time to do for it. But there is a lot of automation in here you probably should be aware of. The ships, as you move them from space to space, will count down the MP value, how many movement points they have left, which makes the game easy to learn, for one thing, but it also helps you keep track of things as game progresses. Please don't move anything around, though, because it is all set for tonight's demo. If you right-click on any of the ports, you'll find a little pop-up menu, and it's just easy to dispatch pieces there or build. Certain vessels can be built in those spaces. You can't. You'll understand why I did some of the things with the module as we move along. But when in doubt, right-click. And so right-clicking on spaces on the map will a lot of times produce a pop-up menu. Okay, so with that background done, let's go ahead and start. What I've done here is I've actually solitaire played a game starting with the 1861 setup, and I've taken it through the year 1861, and we're right here in April of 1862, starting with the Confederate player turn. The sequence of play with the game is very straightforward. You have the Confederate move in combat, and that's probably the hardest thing for wargamers to really grasp with the game, is that combat happens as you move. There is no separate combat phase. It happens as a part of movement. So you start with the Confederate move in combat, then supply for the Confederate builds. That's when you build new pieces, draw new cards. And then you have the Union move in combat, and then the Union build phase. There is no Union supply. Supply really only applies to the Confederacy in this game. And then you have a victory determination, which most times is not going to be relevant. It's really only toward the end of the game that becomes a factor. Okay, what I'm going to do here, I've got hand windows in the Vassal module, but obviously if you're logged in as observer, you can't access those. What I've done is I've taken the cards from the hands and I've placed them into the blue and gray striped areas on the top and bottom of the map. Those areas in normal gameplay are reserved for cards that are in play. It's just a convenient area to put those particular cards that have lapsing or lingering effects. For this demo, I've placed the cards that are actually in a player's hand off to the left-hand side, and cards that are in play temporarily, like the CSS Alabama card for the Confederacy, is going to be on the far right-hand side. So cards on the left are in hand, cards on the right are in play. All war games probably have one issue or another with rules. This is one of those games where the rule book is kind of difficult, and there are some people that have had trouble with it. I personally have missed a lot of rules because just overlooked them, or they were in a place I didn't read carefully. If you were at any of the demos I did at the Concept World Expo, I really screwed up a lot of rules. It's pretty embarrassing stuff. But I think I've got a good enough grasp on them now to actually do this demo. But if you do have the rule book, it's not the easiest of rules, but once you see how the game plays and you go back over the rules, I think you'll find that the stuff is there. The information is there. It's just not organized perhaps as nice as it may have been. I don't know. This is one of those games that I actually pre-ordered on a whim. I was really looking forward to Iron and Oak, and this one looked like it was going to ship about the same time. I thought, oh, what the heck? So I ordered it. It turns out I like this game so much more than Iron and Oak. I mention that now because some people will ask, what about linking up the rules between Iron and Oak and Rebel Raiders? And my answer to that is, I wouldn't mess this game up by mixing in iron and oak. I'm not a huge fan of iron and oak. I'm pretty disappointed with that game. So just to let you know, I've never linked them up, and I have no intention of ever trying to link up the two systems. I know it can be done, but I think this game stands well enough on its own, and I wouldn't want to mix it up with something else. Okay, so with all the preliminaries done, let me take you on a tour of the map. The map spaces is kind of confusing, so let me walk you through it really carefully. First of all, the map is kind of a hybrid. It's a point-to-point map on land, but it's an area map at sea. And I know that sometimes it's hard for players to grasp because the people I've demoed this to in the past seem to have a really hard time visualizing that. So let me walk you through this. On the land, we'll start with the land areas. You have basically 3 different types of spaces on land. You have forts, you have ports, and then you have cities. So you have a city and a port. The only difference between a city and a port is a port, you can build ships there. And you can usually travel along rivers to and from ports, or you can access the ocean from ports, etc. Whereas cities are landlocked. Forts are like city and port spaces, except the only thing you can build there is a battery, which is a defensive game piece. And you'll see there's several of those around the map. Now, the spaces are shaped differently, and once you understand what the different shapes represent, then it kind of will start to click. First of all, you have spaces like, and I'm going to use this control marker here from Louisville. I'm going to borrow Louisville's control marker and move it around as a pointer. Spaces like St. Louis and Cincinnati are a little bit larger than the others, as well as Cairo. I think Washington is also slightly larger. You can build ships there, and so those spaces are a little bit larger to accommodate that. There are stacking limits in the game that we'll talk about in a little bit, but the size of the space isn't all that important. So the spaces that are light baby blue are considered port spaces and Union control. The Confederacy will never gain control of these spaces. So Confederacy can't get St. Louis, Cairo, Cincinnati, or Washington. Louisville is also a port space, and ports are easily identified because they have rounded borders around them. So you see it's a square with a rounded corner. Louisville is a special case. Louisville can be captured by either the Union or the Confederacy, but there's a possible political ramifications for that. In the game in progress, the Union has already taken control of Louisville and paid the political penalty for that. What the penalty is for the Union is you roll 2 dice, and whatever the difference between the die roll is, that's how many VPs the Confederacy gains. So if you rolled a 6 and a 3, then the difference between that is 3, and so the Confederacy would get 3 points. All right, now fort space. Memphis, let me go through the Confederacy ports. The Confederate ports are like a very, very light tan color, again with the rounded corners on them. So Memphis, Arkansas Post, Vicksburg, New Orleans, Galveston, etc. All the way around the coast, those are port spaces. Now, Memphis, Vicksburg, and New Orleans have a green border around them because you pretty much can't win the game without control of the Mississippi. And those 3 spaces define control of the Mississippi. So, in order to control the Mississippi, you have to control all 3 of those for the Union. All right, so ports are squares with rounded corners. Forts, with an F, are pictured in 2 ways. There's forts on rivers that are pictured as stars. So you see Fort Henry and Donelson has a star, and there's a battery that's been built there, as well as Island Number 10. That is considered to be a fort space. So as I see, I moved my ships. The VPs kind of got offset there, so let me fix that real quick. Now on land, where it gets confusing is the rectangular spaces like Corinth, Kennesaw Mountain, Meriden, Fredericksburg, way up here in the north, Goldsboro. Those are fort spaces as well, but they're landlocked. Why they're a different shape is beyond me, but there you go. Personally, I think it would be easier visually if those were done as stars too, because there's really not an important distinction between riverine forts and landlocked forts, but there you go. Land cities like
Joel, Joel, did you say that Corinth and Meriden are forts with an F?
Yes, that's correct. Hold on a second. You're coming through really loud, so give me just a second here. There we go. I brought your volume down. Yes, they are forts with an F. Corinth, Kennesaw Mountain, Meriden, Augusta. Those are all forts. They're not cities. And if you overlooked that, you're not the only one, because I played this completely wrong for a long time before suddenly discovering my error. And you find the answer on page 5 of the rule book. Again, graphically, it's very unintuitive. So there you go. Landlocked cities are like Chattanooga. They're squares like the ports are, but they don't have the rounded corner, and they're shaded a dark gray color like the landlocked forts are. So Chattanooga is one. Montgomery is landlocked city. Richmond and Atlanta are also landlocked cities, but they're pictured as hexagons. Now, there's actually a reason for that. The battery pieces that you place around the game board as a defensive measure, batteries are generated by the city of Atlanta and the city of Richmond. So the hexagonal spaces generate hexagonal pieces. So that actually works really well graphically. So once again, the light colored spaces, very light tan with rounded borders, typically along the rivers and along the coast, are considered to be port spaces, P-O-R-T. Spaces that have a star that look like a fort are forts, F-O-R-T, as are the rectangular dark gray spaces like Corinth, Meriden, Augusta, Kennesaw Mountain. Landlocked cities are squares or hexes. The hex-shaped spaces are special because they create the hexagonal battery pieces. Okay, so we've covered the land spaces. Let's go ahead and look at the ocean. Now, here's where the shift between point-to-point and area map begins. So once more, let me borrow my Union Control piece as a pointer. Out on the sea, you have several different kinds of spaces. First of all, you have circular spaces that are connected by a line to a coastal port, or coastal fort in the case of Jackson and Phillip, just below New Orleans. So what these are called are blockade stations. In order to move from the port to the sea area adjacent to that port or adjoining that port, you actually have to move through the blockade station. So to come out of Galveston, you have to come into the blockade station, and then from there the map changes into an area map. And so now you can move into the West Gulf, and then from there you can move into the East Gulf and South America, and on it goes. So it's at the blockade stations that the map changes from area to point and vice versa. Now there's two types of sea zones. You have coastal zones, and then you have open seas. Okay, and I want to make sure I have the terminology right on that. Just double check. It's actually called coastal and high seas zones. So here's how you define this, and this really could have been a lot cleaner in the rules, but this is how it actually works. If the sea area has a blockade station, it is a coastal sea zone. Period. Okay, so if it's got a round blockade station in it, it is a coastal sea zone. Now what's going to confuse you is if you look at Mexican coast, you'll see that there's a port, and this is a neutral port called Veracruz that's adjacent to it. There's no blockade station because you can't blockade Mexico. Well, you could, but that would start a whole other war. But anyways, even though Mexican coast is adjacent to this neutral port, it is considered to be a high seas zone. The only time it's a coastal zone is if it has a blockade station. If you remember that, you won't go astray in the game. The rules, if you read the rules, sometimes you can get a little mixed up about that. So make sure that that's really clear. So high sea zones are sea areas that do not have the round circular blockade station. Now, as I indicated, there are also neutral ports on the game. You have Veracruz, Havana. Move further out, you have Nassau, West Indies, Brazil. They typically have a flag in them. The exception being Africa does not have a flag in it. But all of the neutral spaces are colored like a pale green color, and they're out in the high sea zones. You cannot blockade them. You can't chase down blockade runners there. We'll get into that in just a moment, but make sure that's very clear. You're blockading the southern coast. You're not blockading neutral ports. One other unique space you need to be aware of is the whaling grounds, which is an area within the Pacific Ocean. So if you look at Pacific Ocean, you can move from there into the whaling grounds for 1 movement point. So it's an area within an area that's a little special because it's a prime hunting ground for raiders, as we'll see a little bit later in the demo. So that's pretty much the rules as far as they go for the map. So we can go ahead and start pushing some counters around here. On the player aid card, if you look at the back of it, where it says player piece and key rules quick check table, this is actually a pretty useful chart. There's a few things on here that really bug me, but for the most part, it's a useful chart because it's going to give you a snapshot of what each game piece can do. Let's talk about the ships here. Pretty much in the game, you have the types of pieces you're going to be interacting with the most are summarized on this quick chart table. The first one is batteries. Batteries are unmovable. You can't move them around once placed. They stay there until you kill them. There's a stacking limit for batteries. You can have no more than 3 in a given space. In combat, they throw 2 dice. They're pretty nasty, and they can only be killed when you throw a 6 against them. So currently there's a buildup going in Memphis. There's 2 batteries there. Looks like 1 battery in New Orleans, but there's 3 batteries down in Jackson and Phillip for now. So they're basically defending the entrance to the Mississippi River. All right, gunboats. Both sides have gunboats. Gunboats are identified by an orange stripe across the top of the game piece in addition to the word that says gunboat. They're generic warships that can move along the rivers, and they can move to a limited extent along the coast in the ocean. Let me explain. The gunboats have 3 movement points. It costs 1 movement point to go from space to space. The stacking limit for ships in any given space is 6, and it applies at all times. Again, this is not clear in the rules that the stacking limit is in effect at all times. That means you cannot temporarily violate stacking. So plan very carefully, or you can end up with traffic jams, especially as the Union. So to move from space to space, it costs you 1 movement point. So this gunboat up in island number 10, if he moves down to Memphis, now he's got 2 movement points left. He can go to Arkansas Post for 1, and then he's got 1 movement point left, and so forth. So that is how gunboats operate. Now there is a difference between the Confederate and the Union gunboats. Confederate gunboats are not permitted to go into coastal sea zones. They can go out into the blockade stations. For example, the boys in Galveston can move out into the blockade station and maybe chase away whatever blockader was there. Brave souls trying to do that. But they're not permitted to go out here. Okay? Now, the Union vessels may go into the coastal sea zones. Just the Confederate ones are not allowed to do that. All right, so that's gunboats for you. Ironclads. Let's talk about them because they're a lot like gunboats in that they only have 3 movement points. They move along rivers, no problem. They can also move into blockade stations, no problem, but they cannot move into any of the sea zones. They can't move into coastal or the high sea zones. So that raises the question, well then, how in the Sam Hill do you get the ironclads to where they need to go if it's along the ocean? Well, how you do that is you have to tow them using a screw sloop. So screw sloops can tow them. It doesn't cost any extra movement points for the screw sloop to tow an ironclad. You simply just move the two together, and then the screw sloop can drop the ironclad off in a blockade station and either remain with it or continue to move. So that's how you, as the Union, you can get your ironclads out there. There's I think one exception is the CSS Albemarle, and that's actually stated on the card itself what that ship is capable of. I believe it's capable of going out into a coastal sea zone. Also, I think there's one raider, the Stonewall Jackson, which functions like a raider, but it conducts combat, as though it were an ironclad. So it's kind of a hybrid ship. All right, so that's ironclads for you. And again, you're going to use those along the rivers, no problem. And the coastal areas, you have to sometimes tow them around to make them of use. Once they're in a blockade station, they can freely enter the port to engage in combat. They don't have to be towed to do that. All right, now at this point, and both sides have ironclads and gunboats, but at this point, the different types of ships diverge. Only the Union has screw sloops. Screw sloops have 6 movement points. They can move along any of the coastal high sea zones, blockade stations. They may move up the Mississippi River as far as Vicksburg, but no further north than that. So that is the capability of the screw sloops. Screw sloops also have the capability of running down blockade runners, but I'll go into that a little bit later here. The Union gunboats have the same capability, but again, we'll cover that in just a moment. The Confederacy has something called blockade runners. We have one here down by South America that's loaded up with a cargo token. These guys have 8 movement points, making them the fastest vessels in the game. They can move into any of the coastal or high sea zones, blockade stations, ports. You can move them up the river, although there's rarely a reason to do so. The only reason you're going to move them along the river is to avoid capture or to enter the port of New Orleans. They can carry 1 cargo token, and 1 cargo token only unless an event card states otherwise. We'll talk about cargo tokens in just a moment. They also have something called raiders. Raiders have the red stripe on them. There's one out in the Indian Ocean. There's also a couple in the Canary Islands, one of which is the special named ship CSS Alabama. And it's the rules governing it are stated on the CSS Alabama card, which is in play on the lower right-hand screen, part of the map on your screen. Raiders have 6 movement points. Their primary function is to create havoc on the high seas, generating Confederate victory points by raiding. They spend, of their 6 movement points, they spend those movement points to hunt down neutral vessels and to score victory points. All right. Let's talk about the victory table. This is probably my last irritation with the game I'll share with you, but and this is truly bizarre, but the Confederate victory points are tracked using a blue token with a Union flag. And why that is beyond me. I'm really hoping they fix that in C3I because in my game I refuse to put that out there. I actually borrowed some pieces from another game to make Confederate VP markers. Same is also true, I guess, of the Confederate cities and ports lost. You track the number of ports and cities, not forts, but ports and cities on this table. Currently, the Confederacy has lost one of those, and so that's why the control marker, the Union control marker, is on the 1 space. That is for the port of Nashville was captured by the Union. Now, Louisville does not count. That's actually a neutral port that was captured by the Union. So that's not tracked on that table. Okay, so I think we're ready to go ahead and start the turn here. During the Confederate move and combat phase, you can do all your movement with your ships and as well as engage in combat if you happen to have something that's known as a cannon pawn. You can actually engage in a limited form of land combat. The land combat is highly abstracted in the game, and its use is governed by cannon pawns that we'll cover a little bit later. The Union always gets 2 cannon pawns every turn. The Confederacy has to spend its build points in order to build 1. They can build a maximum of 1 cannon pawn. And currently they don't have one of those to play around with this turn. So they're just going to be moving their ships. We'll start with some blockade running. Down in South America Sea Zone, you'll see this blockade runner here. He's got 8 movement points. He's loaded up with a cargo token. And what he wants to do is drop this off in a Confederate port. It costs 1 movement point to load up with a cargo token, and it costs you 1 movement point to unload a cargo token. 1 victory point is gained by unloading a 1 cargo token into a Confederate port. There is a limited supply of these tokens. They're kept over on this these little stacks over on the far right-hand side of your screen. And again, the Vassal module is doing a couple odd things with that I need to sort out. But for the most part, these are stowed over here. The module will tell you how many are available. This is important because they're also Cargo 2 markers. The 2 VP markers are generated by the neutral ports of France and England and Spain over on the European waters part of the map. So that's where you get the 2-point cargo tokens, and there's a more limited supply of those. When the Emancipation Proclamation is triggered in the game, and that's going to happen sometime in 1863 or later, when that condition is triggered, 2 of these 2 VP cargo tokens is going to be removed permanently. For using the Vassal module, I've had questions. How do I handle that? It's very simple. You just take them out of that stack or put them into the removed pieces bin right over here. That'll get them out of play. So there you go. I'll probably come up with something a little more elegant later on, but again, it's still a work in progress. All right, so let's take this guy from South America Sea Zone and let's dump off his cargo in Galveston. As soon as you enter a coastal sea zone that contains 1 or more screw sloops, each screw sloop may dice against that moving blockade runner in an attempt to capture him. So the blockade runner has to make what's called a speed roll. So what's going to happen is the Union's going to roll a die, the Confederate's going to roll a die, and if the Union die roll is higher than the Confederate die roll, then the Confederate ship is captured and its cargo is lost. They're both returned to the available stock. Now, the Confederate blockade runners always get a +2 die roll modifier to their speed roll, unless other special conditions apply, which they don't here. I think the only time that doesn't apply is following a naval battle in a port space where there happens to be a blockade runner. He can escape capture if the Union wins the naval battle by making a speed roll without any modifiers. Ties always go to the Confederacy, so early on the blockade is pretty porous and most of the blockade is going to go through. So what's going to happen here, we'll roll for the screw sloop, and he rolls a 4. So unless the Confederacy rolls a 1, this blockade runner is safe. And his roll is a 4 modified up to 6, so he's clearly safe to go, and he may proceed. So he's going to enter the blockade station outside Galveston. Now inside blockade stations, screw sloops as well as gunboats may do searches. So if there was any Union screw sloops or gunboats or both in this circular space, then another speed roll would have to be made. And again, each screw sloop and each gunboat could actually make a die roll. However, in the circular blockade stations, you can do something different. You can choose to forego a die roll in order to gain a +1 modifier, up to a maximum of +2 for the Union. So if the Union had 3 vessels that could search, screw sloops and or gunboats in the Galveston blockade station, they could choose to roll 3 dice, or they could roll 2 dice with a +1, or they could roll 1 die with a +2. It's up to them what they want to do. So hopefully that makes sense to you all there. So this guy's still got 6 movement points left. He moves into Galveston, and now he's going to unload the cargo. So he does a control U on him, and that drops his VPs down and sends the cargo on its way. Actually, it didn't send it like it should have, but oh well. I think I deselected it at the wrong point. Anyways, so he's actually only got 4 movement points left, and he's going to come out 1. I know the marker says 4, but he's got 3. He comes out again, And now another search has got to be made. Now the reason he's moving out again is so he can go pick up another load. You got to keep these boys rolling. It's usually a bad idea to stop movement in a blockade station or a coastal sea zone, and here's why. During the Union turn, screw sloops may use their movement points to proactively search for you, and they can do so at a pretty decent advantage. So it's usually a bad idea to just linger about and loiter in those spaces. So it's better just to go out into the high sea zones and get away from those boys. Again, so we're absolutely clear, blockade runners are absolutely immune from search and seizure on high sea zones. It's very important to remember. All right, so we make a speed roll here. The Union rolls a 3, and so he cannot possibly win the die roll. So we don't have to roll for the Confederacy, because even with a 1 modified to 3, Confederacy will break the ties. With 2 movement points left, he'll move to the Mexican coast, and he'll end his movement in Veracruz, where he'll be poised to pick up a load in the following turn. The boy that's in Galveston hasn't moved yet. There's a blockade runner there. He's going to come out for 1, 2. We make a search. 4 against a 4 modified to 6. He's safe. He comes out here into Veracruz, loads up with cargo, comes back out. Now here's where he's going to stop, because he's only got 2 movement points left. He can't make it into the port, so he's better off just waiting. However, because he's poised here, it might make more sense, since he's got 2 movement points, to go to South America, because now he's got options. Now he's adjacent to West Gulf, East Gulf, the Keys, and it opens up options for him, so that the Union really doesn't know which port he's going to try to gun for in the following turn. So he'll go ahead and stop there. We'll head over here to the north. We got a couple markers here that's got 2 VPs cargo on them up in the North Atlantic. So what we're going to do is we're going to move into, take one of these. Now you can move them together. Naval movement's not necessarily individual. You can move them as a stack. Sorry, I realized I didn't have the microphone key down. We're going to go ahead and start moving these guys here in the North Atlantic. And what we're going to do with these guys is try to run them into either Wilmington and or New Bern. I could move these 2 guys as a stack. I don't have to move individually. You can move ships as a stack if you wish. The problem with moving blockade runners as a stack is you're putting all your eggs in one basket. It is conceivable that the Union will roll a 6 and you'll roll something like a 1, and it would really suck to lose, 2 blockade runners and 4 VPs worth of cargo in one die roll. So I prefer not to move them as a stack whenever possible. It's also a pretty bad strategy to jam up all your blockade runners in a port. If you leave a bunch of them in one port, you create a juicy target to put a whole bunch of gunboats and screw sloops in the blockade station. So that, again, is something to think about. So we're going to move this top guy here into Hatteras Sea Zone, and the screw sloop there will roll a die to try to catch him, and he fails miserably. Then we'll move into the blockade zone here, and the Union gunboat will get an opportunity to dice against him. But before we do, the Union player says wait, and he decides he is going to play the USS Hatteras. Now, actually, in this situation, this is probably bad strategy, because the Union actually has Tempest's Wrath, which would probably be the best card to play at this point. What it would basically do is if you played it before this blockade runner made it into Hatteras, you could force them all into the port of Bermuda, and they couldn't move this turn. But for the sake of the demo, we're just going to go ahead and actually proceed without using the nasty storm event. So they're going to play Hatteras for the event, and what that's going to do is it's going to convert that gunboat into a pretty sweet searching vessel. So to do this in the Vassal module, you simply right-click on the gunboat, and we choose to convert it into the Hatteras, replace with Hatteras, and Hatteras gets +2 to its speed roll. So now Union has a +2, Confederacy has a +2, so it's just an even up roll. And the Union rolls a 1, which is the only roll that would be an auto fail. And so he's going to come in safely and unload his cargo safely for 2 victory points. And we forgot to adjust from Galveston, so we moved it up 1 and then 1, 2 for the new cargo. I'm always forgetting to do that. All right, and now he's got to get out of there. You don't want to just stay in a port if at all possible. You want to get back out to the high seas. The problem is the Hatteras is a pretty good vessel, so it's a 50-50 chance, but we've been lucky so far, so we continue to roll. And the Union has now rolled 3 ones in a row. Come out here, 4 ones in a row, and the Confederacy is just rolling here. So he's off to a good start. He's got 1 movement point left. He could make the channel, or he could duck into Bermuda. Now, Bermuda is only going to generate a 1 VP token, but the turnaround's a lot faster than going all the way to Europe. So he's going to go ahead and do that. There is a blockade runner in New Bern, so he is going to have to make a run for it. So he could stay in port, but let's run for it. The Union's dice suck right now. There you go. A 2 becomes a 4. And they're safe. Comes out here. Union rolls a 1. It's time to fire an admiral somewhere. And he will continue all the way over to France and England with 3 movement points left. He will spend 1 to load up with a 2 VP cargo token. He then comes over here. And he's got 1 movement point left and heads out into the North Atlantic. Okay, the guy that's loaded up with the 2 VP cargo, obviously we're not going to run him into New Bern. That would be pretty stupid because of the Hatteras. So we'll move into the Hatteras Sea Zone. Now there is another card here that might be worth playing. The USS Kearsarge. Play on any screw sloop attempting to catch a raider. Okay, it's only going to be work for raiders, so we'll just hold off on him. So screw sloop rolls another 1. Come into the blockade station, screw sloop roll, or the gunboat rolls a 3. So again, he's safe. He comes into Wilmington. He unloads for 2 more VPs. There we go. And then he comes back out. He's safe. Into Hatteras. Uh-oh. Shoo. Rolling a 5 modified to 7, ducks out of danger there. Again, out into the North Atlantic. You know, the quick turnaround in Bermuda is pretty attractive. So he's going to move into there, and I believe he's actually out of movement points. I don't think we got an accurate count there because of the way I push buttons. Again, the module is not perfect on the movement point calculation thingy. I need a way to fine-tune that. Okay, the blockade runner in Wilmington is going to come out. He comes in here. We do a search, fails. Not here, search, fails. And he'll run into the channel, into England. Spends 2 movement points, loads up. Goes back out. And ends in the North Atlantic. The guy that's in England, he will load up as well. Comes out. There. Now, yeah, we'll go ahead and keep running this. We've done pretty well here. A little superstitious about trying the same port again. Okay, he rolls a 4, so the Union or the Confederacy rolls. He rolls another 4. Comes into the blockade station. A 5 is rolled there, and just barely safe. 3 is modified to 5 for the Confederacy, and so it's a tie. Just barely escapes there. Makes Wilmington, spends movement point to unload for 2 more VPs, and he will stop there. I think that's all of my blockade runners here, so let's go ahead and roll some raiders. But before we do, let's go ahead and jam some of those raiders up with Tempest Wrath. The Union player doesn't like to really mess around with these raiders, so he's going to play Tempest Wrath. And what this does is it causes all Confederate ships in a high sea or coastal zone to move to the nearest neutral port in terms of movement points. Confederate player chooses. Sorry, my mic dropped off again here. Not sure where you lost me, but Tempest Wrath is going to be played against the Raiders in the Canary Islands. So what that's going to do is basically end their turn. They won't be able to move this entire turn. So both ships are targeted. Again, this is a good reason why not to congregate in one area, because there are these cards that can mess you up. So these two guys are going to get jammed up in a port. So we right-click on the event card to generate the storm marker. And it's up to Confederacy where he's going to stick them. The closest ports, there's three that are equidistant. You have Spain, Ponta del Lago, and the Azores, and then Africa. And since they were kind of heading towards the whaling grounds, we'll go ahead and jam them up in Africa. And they will have to end their turn there, and so we'll put the storm marker right here next to them so that they realize that they can't move. Okay, so the guy that's in the Bay of in Spain, he's going to move out into the Bay of Biscay for 1. In order to search for neutral ships, and so gain victory points for the Confederacy, and we ought to discard, actually, Tempest Wrath for that. What we're going to do with this raider here is we're going to spend movement points to search for neutral shipping, but you'll notice that the channel and the Bay of Biscay has the word Europe in parentheses. What that means is the raiders may not search for neutral vessels in that area. The Confederacy does not want to antagonize the European powers that they were courting at this time. So the raider is going to have to move elsewhere to do his hunting. So what he's going to do is he's going to duck into the Azores, and he'll do some hunting in there. It costs 2 movement points to make a search roll. And if he rolls a 1 through 3, he gets nothing. If he rolls a 4 or a 5, he gets 1 victory point. If he rolls a 6, he gets 2 victory points. Now you can spend 2 more movement points in order to modify your search roll by +1. You can spend a maximum of 2 movement points to do that, obviously. With 6 movement points, you can only spend a max of 4 to get your +2. So since he's already spent 2 movement points, the most he could get here is a +1, and he's going to go ahead and do an intensified search, which gives him only 1 die roll, but he'll get a +1 to it. And he rolls a 5, so that was a good expenditure. The 5 is modified to a 6, and he will go up 1 and 2. So they only got 31 victory points. Paul asked, sounds a bit gamey, roll for VPs, and I don't think that's game at all. I think that's just an elegant way of simulating something without a whole lot of rules, really. You don't have to have tokens for neutral vessels, and just roll on a table, basically. That's essentially what you're doing. You're rolling on a table to find out how many VPs you get. Let me talk for a moment about VPs, because it may be helpful to understand what VPs do for the Confederacy. VPs can be spent to build additional military hardware. So think of it as currency. It's also what keeps the Confederacy in the war. Once the VPs get into the negative, bad things begin to happen to the Confederacy. They get fewer cards to operate with during their turn. There's just a lot of bad stuff that happens at that point. So you're going to be dropping off cargo to get victory points. You're going to be rolling on a table to get victory points. And you're going to be spending victory points to build additional ships, batteries, to complement what build points you get. Every turn during the supply phase, we haven't gotten there yet, but in just a moment when we get to the supply phase, every turn the Confederacy is going to lose at least 1 die roll worth of victory points. So essentially the victory points are a representation, if you will, of the means with which the Confederacy is waging war. All right, we got one more raider, I think, to work with, and so let's go ahead and play with him. He could search. He's got a lot of choices. He's in the Indian Ocean. He could search 3 times, 1 die roll each. Potentially, he could get 3 VPs if he rolled high enough on all die rolls. He could actually get 6 if he rolled 3 6s. But he can make for the whaling grounds. Now, here's where the whaling grounds are very attractive, because in the whaling grounds, 1 through 3 means you get nothing when you search. A 4, 5, or 6 will give you 2 victory points. So you don't have to roll a modified 6 to get 2 VPs in the whaling grounds. So we're going to go ahead and make for the whaling grounds. Okay, so he moves here, and as soon as you move into a high sea zone that contains a screw sloop, that screw sloop will search for you. You have to pause and do a speed die roll check. Now here's where players will get confused. The high sea zones, blockade runners cannot be hunted in high sea zones. However, raiders may be hunted in any sea zone or blockade station. Okay, so raiders can pretty much be hunted down anywhere. Blockade runners, the gray striped cargo carrying blockade runners, can only be hunted in coastal sea zones and blockade stations. Raiders, red stripe, they got guns, they shoot back, they can be hunted down anywhere. Now, raiders get a +3 to their speed roll, so they're a little harder to run down. So what we're going to do is we are going to convert, we're going to play the USS Kearsarge, and what that is going to do is turn this screw sloop temporarily into the named ship Kearsarge, which gets the +1 modifier to its speed for the rest of this turn. So the Union rolls a 5, which becomes a 6, and the Confederacy rolls a 2, which becomes a 5. It's less than the modified Union roll, so the Union will get to fight a battle with the Raider. Raiders are not automatically killed when they're caught. Blockade runners are. They have no defensive or offensive armament. So when you catch a blockade runner, it just simply dies and goes back into your available mix. Raiders, however, get to shoot back. Raiders throw 1 die in combat, and they are killed when an opponent throws a 5 or a 6 against it. Screw sloops, whether they're named or not, they roll 2 dice in combat, and they have to roll them against the same target. You can't split fire with a screw sloop, and the screw sloop will also be killed if a 5 or a 6 is rolled against it. So the Union is going to chuck a couple dice here, but first let's see if he's got any cards to play, and he doesn't. That's going to impact this. The Confederacy looks at his cards, and he doesn't have any that's going to impact the naval battle, so the Union rolls a 6 on its first roll. No need to roll the second one. That Raider is going to die. The Raider gets to shoot back, and there's a chance that it'll mutually kill. He rolls a 4 and just misses, so the Kearsarge escapes destruction, but the Raider is killed and goes back into the available mix. Very unfortunate turn of events for the Confederacy. 2 of their Raiders caught in a storm, and a 3rd one killed in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, we do have one more blockade runner move real quick here. Down in the Keys blockade station, he's going to come out for 1, 2, 3, 4 to load up in the Bahamas, 5, 6. We'll do a speed check here. He's safe. These guys really stink. 7 and 8. We don't have enough movement points to unload this turn, but we go into Savannah. He can't be hunted down in Savannah, but if the Union invades amphibiously, he could be destroyed there if the Union was successful in the naval battle. However, there is a battery in Savannah, so that gives a pretty substantial means of protection. So I don't feel unsafe about parking him there for the rest of the turn. We do have a couple of gunboats up on the river, so what we're going to do is just to solidify our protection of the mouth of the Mississippi, we'll move the guy from Vicksburg down 1, 2, and 3 to Jackson and Phillip, and he'll stop there. And now we're going to fight a naval battle, just for giggles and grins, and this is not necessarily good strategy at this point. It would actually be better to do this on the next turn if the situation were to continue as it is now. But there is sometimes a reason to take your ships out of port into a blockade station, because if you drive off the Union ships, you make it easier for the blockade runners to slip into port. For example, up in Norfolk, there's, 4 gunboats in there? And so any ships that are attempting to run in there, they're going to face 2 die rolls with a +2 modifier. So it's pretty much suicide to attempt that. But what could happen is the Confederate Navy has a gunboat and an ironclad in Norfolk, and so they can come out and perhaps destroy all those gunboats or force them to retreat into the sea zone. Now, gunboats can't search in coastal sea zones. They can only search in blockade stations, so they're useless if you drive them off station. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll send the blockade, the ironclad and the gunboat out in the blockade station here and precipitate a a naval battle here. We'll put a marker down. In the vassal module, you may find it convenient to fight your battles out here in this open ground here by the Appalachians. So what's what we'll do here. Combat is simultaneous in ship combat, and it's usually helpful to mark the who the defender's firing at and carry out his fire first as a matter of convenience. Each ship must fire at a pre-designated target, so you have to target who everybody's shooting at before you roll any dice. Ironclad is going to fire at. We'll just fire at these two rightmost gunboats here in the Union line. Ironclads throw 1 die in combat, as you see on that quick chart table or that quick summary. They throw 1 die in combat, but they are only killed if their opponent throws a 6 against them, so they're hard to kill. Gunboats throw only 1 die in combat, and they are killed if a 4, 5, or 6 is thrown against them. So they're cheap and quick to build, but they die pretty fast in combat. So the gunboat fires, and he rolls a 1 and misses. And the ironclad throws a 6 and scores a hit on the gunboat, which we will mark as sunk. However, because combat is simultaneous, he will get to shoot back. The Union player now lines up his ships, and he's going to spend 1 on the gunboat, and then all 3 of the rest are going to fire at the ironclad and hope that one of them gets a 6 against them. So he's kind of hedging his bets there. You don't have to allocate fire in any even manner. I mean, you can gang up I could have all 4 of them fire at the ironclad if I wanted to. But we're just hoping to get maximum results here. So the Union gunboat throws a 2 and misses. And then the 3 gunboats throw a 2, 4, and 3, and so they miss. So the gunboat is now going to be destroyed, removed from play, and we go to the next round. And combat will continue as many rounds as you want. And so in this case right now, after 1 round of combat, the attacker first, and then the defender may choose to break off the action. The Confederate wants to continue it because he's doing actually very well here. So what's going to happen is, as the Union, I think it's smarter just to avoid battle here since all the blockade runners have moved. And just kind of go off out into the sea zone. And now, these guys here, they actually had they spent only 1 of their 3 movement points. So I'm actually going to put them back here and reset them so you can see what they've done. They have 3 movement points. They spent 1 to come out here and fight a battle. They have 2 movement points left. They are not allowed to go into the coastal sea zone, so they can't, pursue out there. But what they can do is move back into port, and that's what they'll do. Because at least back in port, if the Union comes after them, they have the battery, which can help protect them. Let me explain what batteries do. In a naval battle that involves batteries, let's just pretend like we had this situation and there was a battery involved. And we'll just assume that the Union is the attacker here, obviously. If you have a battery involved, the battery can shield the ships from any harm. So you can keep the ships behind the battery, and that means only the battery can be targeted by the naval vessels. Batteries throw 2 dice in combat. They may split their fire, and they are only killed when a 6 is rolled against them. So he can protect the other ships behind him. The other thing you could do is you could put your ships in front of the battery and protect the battery. Well, why would you want to do that? Well, batteries will help you in a land battle. So there's sometimes a reason why you'll want to protect the battery with your ships. You can also fire everybody together. So there you go. John asks, is there a river path from Norfolk to Richmond? In this game, no. The red paths on the map are not river paths, they're land paths. So no, you may not take your ships up to Richmond. Yes, I know the James River rolls up there, but there's that just never worked out for the Union. So I think that's why they did that in the game. So back to the battery, you have 3 choices. You can shield the ships, you can shield the battery, or you can have everybody fight together. Sorry, John, you were asking a question?
So the ships in Norfolk,
the ships in Norfolk?
the ships They can't go anywhere, can they?
No. They can go to the blockade station and back and forth. That's it. Why would you build an ironclad there and a gunboat? Because Norfolk, if you can keep that blockade station clear, it's really a short trip to France and England. So, there's a strategic reason to do that. Also, if Norfolk becomes Union controlled, well, that's the back door to Richmond, and that creates a huge set of problems for the Confederacy. So, yeah, those ships are pretty much stuck there. So we'll put everybody back where they were. And since Johnny brought it up, I didn't mention the land connections and the sea connections. So let me cover that real quick here. River connections are those blue lines drawn between port and fort spaces, mostly in the west. Although you do have the link between Cincinnati, and Cairo. It's not just the Mississippi. Now, there is the case of Chattanooga, which is on a river, but Chattanooga is not a port. There's also the case of the river connection between Henry and Donelson and Chattanooga. There's a river connection there, but you can never move by that river connection. That's why the X is drawn through it. The X is drawn through the city of Chattanooga to show you that that is not a port, even though it's on a river. Here's why that's important. We finished up all of the Confederate movement and assaults, so we go ahead and stop here, and we reset the movement point markers. At this point, we do what's called the supply phase. At this point, every fort space must be able to trace back to a Confederate city or port. A city or port can't be isolated, but a fort can. So Fort Henry and Donelson has a problem because since Nashville fell, it can't trace through Cairo. Cairo is controlled by the Union. It can't trace back to Chattanooga through Nashville because Nashville is controlled by the Union. However, there is that river connection with the X through it. That's the back door to Henry and Donelson, and its only function is to provide a line of supply to Fort Henry and Donelson. If Chattanooga becomes Union controlled, okay, let's say that Chattanooga got Union controlled, then at this point, the battery in Henry and Donelson would be destroyed and go back to the available stock, and a control marker would be placed on Henry and Donelson. For the Union, I should say at this point, the Union also does trace supply as well for its spaces. Fort spaces that are controlled by the Union, if they can't trace back to a Union-controlled city or port, then they get flipped over to an isolated fort space. And if they remain that way until the next supply phase, then it's removed, and so the Confederacy can regain those spaces by cutting off supply lines. So that is how those land spaces, the connections between spaces work. So we'll put everything back here. Any questions so far about how things work here in the game? Okay, it is now the Union turn, and I'm not going to belabor this. This actually is going to go pretty quick. We have 2 cannon pawns with which to conduct land battles, and since we haven't really done that, let me talk a little bit about land battles. The cannon pawns allow you to take control of the spaces on land by a method known as assault. So you can assault along a land connection from any Union-controlled space. So from Washington, right now, we could spend one of these cannons and attack Fredericksburg. If we capture it, then we could spend the next cannon to make a shot at Richmond if we wanted to. The point is, with only 2 cannon pawns, we only get 2 attacks, so spend wisely. Only one of those cannon pawns may be used to conduct an amphibious assault against a Confederate space from the ocean. So if you're doing an amphibious assault from an ocean approach, you can only do one amphibious assault. You can do an unlimited number of amphibious assaults along rivers. So if we wanted to, we could take our ironclad and our little force of gunboats from Cairo down to island number 10. We'd have a huge naval battle, and then we would have an amphibious assault. That's the only means of conducting an assault on island number 10 because it's stuck between 2 rivers. Duh, it's called an island. So you can do an unlimited number of amphibious assaults along rivers, but only one against, say, a juicy target like Key West. Now here's where strategy comes in. Key West and Galveston are a couple of my favorite ones to try to take out as early as possible, and here's why. Once you gain control of Key West, you no longer have to blockade the Keys coastal sea zone. That frees up all those ships to be somewhere else. With Galveston, it's kind of the same thing. Once you take control of Galveston, then the only way to get to a port in the West Gulf is up the river to New Orleans, which is harder to get to for the Confederacy, and there's only one approach to it, so you can jam up a bunch of ships in the New Orleans blockade station space. So a little bit of strategy for you there. Looking at our menu of options here, I think for this demo's purpose, we'll go ahead and actually do a riverine amphibious assault to show you how this works. Because there are ships in island number 10, we must do two things. And this, again, is not very clear in the rules, but ultimately this is, I believe, how it works. In order to go into, yeah, I did skip the CSA build because I'm running out of time here. In order to go into the island number 10 space to do an assault, if there are ships there, then you have to bring your ships with you. If there were no Confederate vessels in island number 10, then we could actually just plop down a pawn here and make an attack on it. Even though there's a battery there, you can make an attack on it without bringing any of your ships into harm's way. But because there are enemy vessels there, you have to bring your own ships in, drive off all of the enemy ships, and then you plop down the amphibious assault pawn. Something else very, very important is that if you move your enemy, in order to move ships into harm's way, where there's, in order to move the Confederate, or excuse me, the Union fleet from Cairo into island number 10, I have to have a pawn available. You can't just run in there, fight a naval battle, kill a bunch of ships, and then retreat. You actually have to have a cannon pawn available in order to move into a Confederate-controlled fort or port space with your own ships. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to run through a couple of assaults really fast. I'll show you how screw sloops are going to run down raiders, and then we're going to do the build phases together because I'm running out of time here in the demo. So this is how an assault would work. We would bring our ships down here from Cairo. As a matter of convenience, in a physical game, you could use one of these commander pawns. They have little stand-up holders to hold them, and then you could put all the ships in their box and just move the commander around. In Vassal, I find it more convenient to actually just stack the ships with the commander if you're going to use the commander tokens. The only reason you're going to use the commander tokens, there's only a couple of cases where the commander token is actually important, and that is there are a couple cards that impact ships that are stacked with Porter and ships that are stacked with Farragut. And it's only certain events that impact those. And so at any point, you can choose to take ships off the map and put them into a commander's box and put the commander in their place on the map. If you choose to take a commander off the map and put the ships back where the commander was, then that commander has to be out of play for the rest of that turn, and on the following turn you can put him back into play. So that's commanders in a nutshell. So we're not going to worry about that here. So for this battle, what we'll do is we're just going to run through really quick some of the things that can happen here in an amphibious assault. So the Union's got a lot of gunboats, but they, like I said, they're a dime a dozen. They die pretty quick. The Confederacy has a bunch of gunboats of its own, but he's got some tough choices to make. The amphibious assault cannot be made until the ships are destroyed. So that's a good reason to hide them behind the battery. But if the battery survives naval combat and the ships decide they don't want to attack the battery anymore, once all the Confederate ships are destroyed, they can go ahead and conduct the land assault. If the battery is still there during the land assault, the Confederacy will get an edge in the land assault. In our case here, just for grins, I think the best strategy is just to brouhaha with everybody and his brother shooting. So the battery is going to target the ironclad with both of its dice, and then the gunboats are going to each shoot at one of the Union gunboats. One Union gunboat will not be targeted. So here comes the shot at the ironclad, and the clad is safe. And then the gunboats from left to right roll hit, miss, miss, hit. So we'll flip them over to their sunk sides. I think it was just 2 of them that got hit. Actually, I think it was the first and last that took hits. So there we go. Now it's the Union side's chance to shoot, and since the gunboats are the priority here, because you can't do the land assault without them, they'll go ahead and target all of the gunboats for sure, and then the clad and 1 gunboat will throw down on the battery. So 3 dice coming at the battery, and the battery just survives. Going from right to left on the or left to right on the gunboats, we have miss, hit, miss, miss. So that's a pretty horrible result for the Union. Okay, now the attacker has first option withdraw, but if the Union withdraws, they lose the cannon pawn that they've already committed to this assault, and they would lose victory points equal to a die roll. The Confederacy would gain victory points equal to the difference between 2 die rolls. So we'll go ahead and stick it out 1 more round. At this point, each Confederate gunboat's going to fire at a gunboat, and the battery will throw down on the clad. And the clad is safe, and 1, 2, 3. We have 2 more hits on gunboats, so hopefully the gunboats will score well here. Each gunboat is going to fire, and the ironclad is going to fire. So ironclad fires, misses, and then gunboat hit, hit, hit. Clean sweep. So these guys are all destroyed. Now, tough call here. We could go at 1 more round, but we really don't want to lose our ironclad. But we get 2 more shots at the battery, and it would be really nice to kill the battery for the land battle. So we'll stick it out for 1 more round. Confederacy throws down on the clad, obviously, and he misses again. The Union throws down both on the battery, obviously, and kills them on the last roll. There's no victory points gained for that. The only thing that's happened at this point is the naval battle has been won and the battery's been destroyed ahead of the ground troops. At this point, the assault takes place, so the cannon pawn that we've committed is now used. And how this works can be kind of confusing. Each side is going to roll a certain number of dice against one another. You take your best die roll, your highest die roll, and then you're going to apply modifiers to it. And if the Union's modified result is higher than the Confederacy, they capture the space. And the Confederacy loses victory points equal to the difference between the die rolls. If the Confederate die roll is higher than or equal to, the assault fails, the Confederacy retains control, and the Confederacy gains victory points equal to the difference between the die rolls. So what we're going to do here is we'll look at how many die rolls each side gets. The Confederacy always gets 2 dice on defense, always. No matter what, they will always get 2 dice. They add 1 additional die if the target is Richmond. They add additional die for each battery in the space. So if you had Richmond with 3 batteries, you would have 2 for the space itself, a 3rd because it's Richmond, and then 3 more for the batteries, so a total of 6 dice you'll be throwing. Now the modifiers that you would add in addition to the die roll result is you get +1 for each set of doubles that you roll. So if 2 of your die rolls match, that's a +1 modifier to your highest die roll. So if I rolled a 1, and a 4, my final result would be reckoned to be a 5. The 4 was my highest die roll, and the 2 1s are a pair, so that as a +1 modifier to my best die roll. If I rolled a 3 1s and a 6, that would actually become a 7 because every time you roll triples, a +2 is added to your best die roll. So again, I don't know of any other game that has a mechanic quite like this. So we got this wrong quite a bit until we read the rules really carefully. I think that's about it on that. So for the Union, the number of dice the Union rolls is tied to the turn track. So if you look at the turn track, on April 1862 it says the Union gets 6 build points and the Union gets 2 dice in land combat. Another way to remember this is the Union gets a number of dice equal to the final digit of the year. So if it's 1862, they get 2 dice. 63, 3 dice. 64, 4 dice. And 65 being the exception to that. And April 65 only happens per a special card event. Alrighty, so here in this case, since it's 1862, the Union is going to get 2 dice to roll. And in addition to this, the Union has a special capability, and only the Union can do this. This is another rule we messed up before. But the Union can choose to forego up to 2 die rolls in order to add a +1 modifier for each die he does not roll. Now you have to obviously roll at least 1 die. So in 1861, I can choose to roll 2 dice, or I can choose to roll 1 and then add a +1 to it. So kind of a tough call here. For grins, let's just go ahead and say we're going to throw 1 die and hope for the best. So he rolls a 5, and that's a pretty good roll, becomes a 6. So the modified Union rolls a 6. The Confederacy rolls 2 dice, and again, it's good we killed the battery because otherwise the battery would give the Confederacy a 3rd die. And they roll a 2, we're looking good. And there's a 4, so their highest die roll was the 4, and they didn't roll any doubles. Obviously, with 2 dice, you can't roll triples, so no modifiers there. If they have a card, sometimes you'll have a card that says, hey, you can play this after the dice are rolled to get a reroll. If we look at the Confederate cards that they have in their hand, they have a card called Rallymen. But you have to play this before any dice are rolled. Because this wasn't that critical of a space, I wouldn't actually use that there. I'd use that more if the Confederacy were to go after a space like the Keys, Key West, etc. So there you go. Okay, regarding the cards, we haven't really talked about them a whole lot. Cards can be played at any time that the card says it can be played at. So whatever the card says, that's when you can play it, and it's not always clear. Sometimes the wording's a little loosey-goosey on the cards. For Rallymen, if you look at the text on the card, it says play at the start of any assault or Confederate counterattack. A Confederate counterattack is basically an assault done with a Confederate assault or cannon pawn, and that's done during the Confederate player's movement and combat phase. All right, and they didn't have the opportunity. They didn't buy one of those previously, so they didn't have one of those to use. Okay, so in this case, the difference between the die rolls, the Union die was a 5, the best Confederate was a 6. The Union die was a 5, it was modified to a 6. The best Confederate die was a 4, so the difference is 2. So because the Union won, the Confederacy will lose 2 victory points. So they now have 29, and we will mark control in island number 10. If a city is taken control of, in addition to the points you gain from the die roll differential, you also roll a single die, and that's how many additional victory points the Confederacy loses. So, for example, if we were to capture Memphis, in addition to losing points equal to the die roll differential, the Confederacy will lose die roll worth of victory points from 1 to 6. There is a couple exceptions to that. Atlanta, the very first time and only the first time that Atlanta is captured, the arsenal is destroyed, which means that they would no longer be able to build batteries from that space. And the Confederacy, in addition to losing a die roll worth of victory points and the differential, they would lose 2 additional die rolls worth of victory points. So for a grand total of 3 die rolls worth of victory points. Yeah, it can really hurt. Richmond, you lose 3 additional die rolls. In addition to the ordinary die roll, you have 3 more for a total of 4 die rolls worth of victory points you lose if Richmond is captured. And the battery is destroyed, or the arsenal is destroyed for the rest of the game. When the final port on the Mississippi, Memphis, Vicksburg, New Orleans, when that final port, please be aware the Arkansas post is not on the Mississippi. It's on the Arkansas Red River. I think it's on the Red River. Arkansas post is not a part of that chain. When the final of the 3, Memphis, Vicksburg, New Orleans, is captured, then you lose an additional die roll. And it's only the first time that happens. So if the Confederacy were to recapture Vicksburg with a counterattack, and then the Union got it back, they wouldn't get that additional die. That additional die roll that they lose in VPs only happens the first time that it is captured. Okay, now I didn't talk about the build phase, so let's go ahead and look at that. Well, before I do, let me cover screw sloops. One thing about that they can do during the Union's turn, screw sloops can proactively search for blockade runners and or raiders. They cannot search for blockade runners on high sea zones. We already covered that, but they can search for raiders anywhere. To do so, they have to spend 2 movement points, and they have to do a speed roll. They can modify their speed roll by +1 by spending additional 2 movement points. So, since we got the Kearsarge here, let's just pretend that we had a raider in the Indian Ocean. The Kearsarge has 6 movement points, and he moves into the Indian Ocean. He then spends 2 movement points to do a search, and he's got 3 points remaining, so he'll spend 2 more to add +1 to his speed roll. And because it's the Kearsarge, he already gets +1 to his speed roll, so his speed roll is going to be modified by a grand total of +2. He rolls a 6, which is the best he can do there. That becomes a modified 8. The Raider then makes his die roll, which is always modified by +3. And a 3 and a 2 is not going to be enough, and so a land or a sea battle would take place here, and let's just roll that out, see what would happen. The Union rolls, let's just pretend like the Union rolled a 2 and a 3. Okay, if that were to happen and then the Raider missed as well, after 1 round of combat, the defender, as well as the attacker, they can choose to break off the action and retreat. And so in this case, the Raider could actually retreat into an adjacent space like African waters, or you could retreat into the Pacific Ocean, which is where the Kearsarge came from. You can retreat to any adjacent space. So that's the skinny on the screw sloops. All right, build phase. I skipped over this in the interest of time, and so I'm just going to cover this once. I'm not going to do the Union builds here. I'll just go into the Confederate builds. The number of build points that the Confederacy get is tied to the number of Confederate cities and ports lost. You'll notice that we did not modify this track when we captured island number 10. That's because island number 10 was not it's not a port or a city. So we're not going to track that at all. It's only the space. If we took if we took Memphis, then we push that token up to the 2 space, and so forth. Okay, so right now, as long as the Confederacy has not lost 5 cities and ports, they will get 5 builds. So you see the 5 builds over on the right-hand column. As soon as they've lost 5 cities, ports, they get 4 builds. When they lose up to 9 cities and ports, now they're down to 3 builds, and on it goes. Build points are spent in this way. You can spend 1 movement point to build the following: a gunboat, or a blockade runner, or a raider. Each of those will cost 1 build point. An ironclad also costs a build point, but there's some special things that happen with building ironclads and raiders. In order to build a raider, you have to spend a build point and you have to spend a victory point, and you can build those over in Europe. So that's the deal with raiders, and you can only build 1 per turn, and their number is strictly limited. All of the ships are limited to the counter mix, but you have a very limited number of raiders that you can build. So that's how you get raiders into the game. Blockade runners can be built at any Confederate port. In addition, you can, in each year, 1861, you can build 1 blockade runner in a neutral port, any neutral port. You can build it over in Europe, which is really the ideal place to build those, by the way. In 1862, you can build 2 in neutral ports. 63, you can build 3 in neutral ports. 64, you build 4 in neutral ports. You're probably not going to be doing that, though, because 1864, the blockade runners become a losing proposition. Usually the blockade's pretty tight by then, but theoretically you could build 4 of them overseas. If you build them in Confederate ports, only 1 ship and 1 ship only may be placed in a Confederate port when you're building them. So If you build a blockade runner in New Orleans, you can't build a gunboat there. You'd have to build a gunboat maybe in Vicksburg, but if you build a gunboat in Vicksburg, you can't put an ironclad there. Only one new ship per build phase per Confederate port is the best way to understand that. Ironclads take time to build, and they may not be built on the very first turn of the game. April 1861, neither player may build an ironclad. To build an ironclad, you have to do a couple things as the Confederacy. First of all, the space of Atlanta, as long as the Atlanta arsenal is not destroyed, and Richmond, as long as the Richmond arsenal is not destroyed, each of those spaces may be used to build a single battery for a grand total of 2 batteries between the two. Batteries may be placed in any Confederate-controlled space on the map, up to a maximum of 3. You can't have more than 3 batteries in a space, and then you can only build 1 new battery in a space per turn. So you can't use Atlanta and Richmond to put 2 batteries in a single turn in Fredericksburg, for example. You can use Atlanta to build a battery in Memphis, and then use Richmond to build one, say, in Charleston or somewhere else. So that's how batteries work. Now, to build an ironclad, you have to forego the building of a battery and spend 1 build point, and the newly built ironclad is placed on the turn track for the following turn. So you won't get to place it on the map until the following turn, and you won't get to actually use it until 2 turns from now. So if the Confederacy were to take this ironclad and build it, it's going to show up on the turn track for the following turn. During the build phase of the August 1862 turn, they would be able to place the ironclad into a Confederate port, and then in December of 1862, they would actually be able to start using that vessel, moving it around and such. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. So again, to build an ironclad, you have to forego the building of a single battery, and you have to spend a build point, and you got to put it on the turn track. So difficult to do, not always the best thing to do. You can kind of think of ironclads as an underpowered portable battery in a sense. Okay, so that's the things that the ships that the Confederacy can build. For spending 3 cannon pawn or spending 3 builds, they may build a cannon pawn, and they may use this to counterattack Union-controlled Confederate spaces during the Confederate movement and combat phase. Now remember, you cannot ever capture the Union spaces of St. Louis, Cairo, Cincinnati, or Washington. But you can use a cannon to recapture space that the Union's gotten a hold of. So if you could use that to launch an attack on Nashville by the land route from Chattanooga and try to recapture that space, push the Union back. The Confederacy will always throw 2 dice in assault on defense, but on offense, from 1862 onwards, they will throw 3 dice when counterattacking. So try to remember that. But again, you have to spend build points to build a cannon pawn, and then the cannon pawn will be available on the following turn and the following turn only. If you choose not to use it on the following turn, then it is lost and you wasted your build points. Okay, so say you don't have enough build points to build something, build everything you want. Well, that's going to be pretty common, but there is another way that you can build additional pieces by spending your victory points. And here's where I have a problem with the quick check table. There's something known as special build points. And the quick check table does not make this very clear at all. First of all, if you look at the cost column on the play pieces, key rules, quick check table, if you look at the cost builds / points table, you'll see that there's a numeric value followed by a hash mark and then another numeric value. Here's where this gets confusing. The number to the left is how many build points it costs to build that particular piece. For a battery, you're not spending build points to actually build it. You simply place one if the arsenal at Richmond or Atlanta is intact. Okay, so you're not spending build points for that. But for a gunboat, you spend 1 build point, and so that's why you see a 1 to the left of the hash mark. The number on the right of the hash mark is the number of special build points. And this is where the chart does not make this clear at all. And it's really badly done because one special build point is the equivalent to 5 victory points. So really, they should have put the number of victory points to the right of the hash mark. That would have made it a lot easier on the players. So essentially, if you look at the number to the right of the hash mark, multiply that number by 5, that's how many victory points it costs. So if you wanted to build a third battery, you could do that. You could use your Richmond arsenal to build a battery one place, use Atlanta to build a battery somewhere else, and then you could spend a grand total of 20 victory points to put a third battery down somewhere. You could spend 20 more victory points if you're really daring to build a fourth one, but spending 40 victory points is a pretty huge deal. And you can get a little bit spendthrift, because from 1861 to 1862, you're going to find the Confederate VP values skyrocketing. And in fact, at the end of the supply phase, if they're over 50, they're going to automatically drop down to 50. So just be aware of that. It caps out at 50 at the end of each supply phase. However, 1863-64, it can go down awfully fast. I mean, really, really fast it can drop. So be careful about spending those too frivolously. Gunboat, for example, has a 1 to the right of the hash mark, so you can spend 5 victory points to build it. You could build a Confederate ironclad for, again, 20 victory points. That's a lot of points to spend to build an ironclad. That would free you up from having to forego the use of one of your battery builds. So there you go. Raider, if you want to build a Raider with special victory points, it would cost you 6. 5 for the build itself, and then the additional special victory points. If the Confederates have no VPs, there is a special note that you can build a Raider for 2 build points, but that's only if you have no VPs. If your VPs are zeroed or at in the negative, in the red. Okay, for the Union side, the Union builds are a little bit more straightforward. They don't have special build points. You can't, give the Confederacy VPs to build for the Union. The Union, however, gets a free gunboat every turn in Cairo and in the Navy Yards. There is no stacking limit in the Navy Yards. You can stack as much as you want there, and the Navy Yards is adjacent to the Chesapeake Coastal Sea Zone. If they build a screw sloop, it costs 2 build points to build a screw sloop or an ironclad, and the builds are delayed for 1 turn. So when the Union builds a screw sloop or ironclad, the pieces go on the turn track for the following turn, and the turn after that you actually get to use them. So you have to really plan ahead with the Union. The number of build points the Union gets is tied to the turn track, and it goes up. It just relentlessly goes up to a maximum of 10 build points in a turn. The Union may spend 4 build points to build an additional cannon pawn, but they can only have, the number of cannon pawns in the game is 4, so you max out there at 4 cannon pawns. You can't build any more than that, even if you had additional builds. About 1863, you need to start thinking about slowing down your naval builds and starting to build more land, more cannons for your land offensives. So just a little strategy tip there for you. It's easy to forget, but before you do any builds, you get to draw 3 cards each turn. So let's just say it's a Confederate build phase. You draw 3 cards off the top of the deck. The only cards that can be played at this point, if any of the cards that you just drew say you may play it during the production phase or the build phase, you can go ahead and use it right away. But other than that, it's going to go into your hand. You have a maximum hand size of 6. If you have more cards than that in your hand, you have to discard down. Now, several cards have a year up in the upper right-hand corner with an X through it. In those cases, those cards may not be played in those years. So Cold Harbor can't be played in 1861. John Bell Hood cannot be played until 1864 or later. So that's the story on the cards. And again, the cards, read what they say, read them carefully. The wording's not always perfect, but for the most part, you'll be able to get by without having to ask too many questions. Be sure you pay attention to the bottom text that tells you what to do with the card after it's played, because some of them go right back in, they get shuffled immediately back into the deck. Sometimes they get shuffled into the deck on the following turn, and so there's kind of a delay before it gets cycled into the deck. You will not see every card in the game every game. It's just impossible. The way the deck is constructed, each game is going to be probably very different because of the card mix. There are a couple triggers that will trigger a reshuffle. There's a card in each deck that will trigger a reshuffle. I think there might be 2 in the Confederate deck that triggers a reshuffle. In 1863, following any Union victory on land in a city or port, I think it might also be in a fort, the Emancipation Proclamation is triggered. Emancipation Proclamation is not a card event. It's something that simply happens during 1863 or after, when the Union captures any Confederate port or city. Not fort, but port or city. I just looked it up to make sure I had that right. When that happens, a couple things take place. You remove a couple VP tokens permanently from play. There's certain cards that are going to be removed from the Confederate deck. The Trent Affair, Maximilian, Royal Navy. And then both decks are going to be reconstituted and reshuffled. So the discard pile and everything that gets shuffled up. Cards that are in your hand or that are in play are safe, but everything in the discard pile gets shuffled up. The Confederate draw and discard pile gets shuffled up as well, and so that's the Emancipation Proclamation. And that is pretty much the nuts and bolts of the game. I don't have time to really go into all of the little details. There's a lot of little things that can happen. One thing I probably could tell you is about screw sloops in a naval battle. Screw sloops and ironclads interact in a very interesting way. You can have, in a naval battle, you can have an ironclad and a screw sloop in a naval battle. If that's the case, the ironclad can screen the screw sloop, thus making the screw sloop non-targetable. And the screw sloop, if it's being screened, still gets to fire, but with only 1 die. Now this is in a naval battle. Okay. This is a naval battle against batteries. Let me make that clear. Not a naval battle against just enemy ships. A naval battle against batteries, the ironclad can screen a screw sloop. Okay? A screw sloop can then screen a gunboat. So if you have ironclad, screw sloop, and gunboat in a battle with a battery and other vessels, there can be other vessels involved, but if there's a battery involved in it, then the ironclad can screen the screw sloop. The screw sloop can screen the gunboat. In this case, the gunboat does not get to fire, but it can't be shot at by the battery. The screw sloop is protected by the ironclad and only fires with 1 die, and the ironclad, of course, functions normally. So again, that's easy to mix up. A lot of times we got this wrong. We thought this was for all naval battles, but it's actually only when there's a battery, a battle against, where there's a battery in play. Be very careful with the event cards for the Union involving named ships. They only impact a single battle. It's not a permanent change of status. So if you played something like the USS Brooklyn and a ship turns into the USS Brooklyn, it's not permanent. There's only one Union ship that is permanent, or semi-permanent I should say, and I believe that's the USS Hartford. Once a ship becomes the Hartford, it's really hard to get the Hartford off the map and back to a generic. I'd have to look up the exact card text for you, but that's really the only case of one named ship for the Union that's going to stick around for any length of time beyond a single game turn or a single battle. How do you win the game? Let me cover that really quickly in conclusion tonight. It's way in the back of the rule book, and it's kind of wordy, but you really want to make sure you understand this as a Union, because frankly, and the thing I really like about this game is you really don't have time to dilly-dally as the Union. I had a player that really doesn't like dice and games, and this really wasn't his cup of tea, but he was asking me, why would you even bother to attack in land in 1861 since you only throw 1 die in a land assault and the Confederacy rolls 2, and if they got a battery they roll 3. He says, why would you do that? Because if you get lucky, it gets you ahead of the 8 ball. It's worth the risk. It's worth giving the Confederacy is going to get VPs anyways. But if you capture spaces early, use the cannon pawns. Never just waste a cannon pawn and not use it. Just if you've got a cannon pawn, attack something because you don't have time to dilly-dally. The game ends with sudden death Union victory at the end of any Union turn in which the Union controls the Mississippi, Memphis, Vicksburg, New Orleans, and Atlanta, and Richmond, while the Confederacy has a negative VP total. So that's your goal. It's a fourfold goal. You got to have negative Confederate VPs. You have to have control of Richmond, Atlanta, and the Mississippi. If that's not met, then the game continues. At the end of the of game turn 12, or if the game goes into a possible turn 13, at the end of that, then you check for another condition. At the conclusion of the game, if you run out of game turns, the Union wins if it fulfills the original condition, control of Richmond, Atlanta, the Mississippi, and negative VPs, or if the Union controls 16 or more Confederate inland and port cities, one of which must be Richmond or Atlanta, and control of the Mississippi and a negative VP value. That's going to be tricky to do, but if you just can't get control of Richmond because Bobby Lee and Stonewall Jackson are still alive, well then you want to start thinking about going after all those other little cities that otherwise would be meaningless. Because if you can get the 16 cities, then maybe that'll put you there and win the game at the end. Bottom line is this: you cannot win without the Mississippi. So do not neglect the West. The war is won or lost in the West. So that's how you win the game. For the Confederacy, you're going to run wild in 1861-62. Starting in 1863, you want to make sure you are building raiders early on because they're going to be your bread and butter late in the game. Your blockaders are going to be next to useless late in the game. Your raiders are going to be really what's keeping you afloat. And that is Rebel Raiders for you, folks.